Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you. How you doing?
Doing good. Let me go ahead and introduce what we're doing today, and then we can get into our little chat here.
Fantastic.
Hello, everyone who's listening today. My name is Justin Stapley. I'm the state director with the Utah Reagan Caucus. Um,
Go Reagan. Go Reagan.
exactly. Oh, I'm getting feedback. 1 second. Okay. Sorry, another technical difficulty. All of a sudden, I was hearing an echo of ourselves. Um, One of the big issues that obviously Reagan cared about and that we care about at the Utah Reagan Caucus is consistency and fiscal conservatism, not just posturing about fiscal conservatism, but consistency in that. And that's why we have endorsed John Dougall for Utah District 3, because fiscal conservatism is nothing new to you, is it?
Nope. Nope. Been doing it for decades.
Um, we've kind of ran into this interesting situation right now in both American politics and to a certain extent Utah politics, where when Republicans are out of power, they like to talk about fiscal responsibility a lot. But when they get into power, they've been dropping the ball considerably. The rate at which debt has increased over the last 20-25 years has not varied a lot between Republican and Democratic administrations. And what we're seeing in Congress is a lot of times people will talk a big game, but then they kind of just play as team members of the presidential administration and not really, focus a lot of it. I think even at one point, Rush Limbaugh essentially confessed that fiscal conservatism was dead sometime in 2018 or 2019. Um, but what has impressed us with you is going back over 20 years, both in the Utah House of Representatives and then as a state auditor, you've really walked the walk as opposed to just talking the talk. And can you kind of give us a few minutes about why this means so much to you?
Well, I guess part of the reason that means so much to me and I'll tell you a little bit of backstory. So growing up, I learned the importance of a dollar, and I had to work and provide. I'm the oldest of 11 kids. My dad was frugal Dougal before I was even born. As the oldest of 11 kids, frugal is all I ever knew growing up. And so I understood what it took to work and pay. And when I started paying taxes, it was this eye-opening experience of, wait a second, I did all this work and the government got to keep this money. And then um, I had an experience later when I got an elected office and I started looking at how many officials would talk about being conservative, especially fiscally conservative, and they didn't practice what they preached. And I was wrestling and struggling with that. And Frederick Bastiat, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he wrote an essay called That Which is Seen and That Which is Not Seen, where he described what he called the broken window fallacy. Now, let me describe that to you and those listening. Imagine, if you will, a teenage kid walking down the street, picks up a rock and throws it through the shopkeeper's window. Well, what happens? Shopkeeper now has to fix the window. So the window replacement guy and the glass maker get business. And the townspeople start to think to themselves, let's break more windows. It's good for the economy. What's the fallacy there? While they could see the good that was done by paying to fix the window, they couldn't see the harm that was caused because the shopkeeper couldn't use his or her money for another purpose. They had to waste it fixing the window. And that's what it is with taxes. What happens is politicians and the public like to celebrate all the good that they do with your tax money, your hard earned tax money. But they forget what you would have done otherwise if you weren't forced to pay it. And I remind folks, people don't just wake up in the morning and say, oh, yippee, I want to pay more taxes. You pay taxes because you're afraid of the bad stuff the government will do, because the government will either take your property or might even take your liberty if you don't pay your taxes. And so that was an eye-opening experience to me to help remind folks this isn't just free money for us to do whatever we want to with it. People work very hard for their taxes, and you're forgetting the harm that you're causing. I would remind when folks would describe it's just a Big Mac a month. That's back when a Big Mac cost $5. I don't know what it is these days. Thanks, inflation. But so $60 a year. And they're like, no big deal. It's just a Big Mac a month. But that $60 is the difference between somebody being able to provide for their family and all of a sudden being kicked onto welfare. And you and I might think of it as not very much, but it adds up and it adds up and it adds up. And so that is why I'm so passionate about limiting government, limiting its spending, and keeping that money with the people to the greatest extent possible. And I'm one of those that I'm a hardcore fiscal conservative, and I want to maximize. People tease me that when I was in the legislature in 2007, I championed the largest tax cut in Utah history at the time, and passed it unanimously in the House and the Senate. And I complained it wasn't enough. And that's part of the background of why I come from that perspective. Now, if you look at the Tea Party, and I think lots of us remember the Tea Party, the problem I have with the Tea Party is they talked a good talk about fiscal conservatism, but they didn't practice it. Because what I would hear folks say is basically cut all their programs, but don't touch mine. Don't touch national defense. Don't touch transportation. Don't touch Social Security or Medicare, on and on and on. But go ahead and cut all the Democrat programs. And that's not how it works from my perspective. When it comes to the federal level, we've got trillions of dollars in debt every year. We got to cut like almost every program if we're going to balance the budget. Right now, we could wipe out everything that we call discretionary spending, which includes national defense, and we'd barely balance the budget. That is the dire situation we're in at the federal level. And because of that, it crowds out so many other things that might be happening. It pushes, in that case, inflation, which drives up the cost of you providing for your family or running your business. It pushes for higher taxes, which takes money directly away from your business or your family. It crowds out business investment, and all of that weakens the economy. And in a time where we need to be cutting spending and growing the economy, dig ourselves out of this hole, that's going in the wrong direction.
How do we go about actually accomplishing this? Utah, it's a little bit easier because we do have balanced budget amendment in the Utah Constitution. We obviously don't have that in the federal government, and we're probably not going to have enough support in Congress, enough senators to pass a balanced budget constitutional amendment anytime soon. Is there a way to reel in the spending unless the House and the Senate are forced to do it?
No, I mean, they got to be forced to do it. And force comes in one of two ways. Force comes from either the electorate, the public, clamoring and demanding it. And unfortunately, we're a credit card nation. So we love quote unquote free stuff that somebody else pays for. So that makes it hard. Or things come crashing down in such a sense that it's dire and we're desperate. But in desperation, you usually get bad solutions.
Right.
So that's unfortunately what it takes. Now, you talked about Utah having a balanced budget. And part of that is a constitutional amendment that requires us to balance our budget. But part of that is also our culture and our practices. I tell folks, even if we had a constitutional amendment at the federal level, they're probably going to have a bunch of loopholes in it, like for defense-related issues or national security, or if we're at war. So, we've been at war perpetually for decades now. So they're going to use that as carve-out to say, well, the balanced budget amendment doesn't apply. But the other key thing is you actually have to put it into practice. It's a cultural dynamic. And we have a constitution where the federal government is supposed to be limited powers, limited authority. Well, do any of us really believe that the federal government believes that it's limited and bounded? I mean, Congress spending out of control and doesn't seem to recognize any bounds within the Constitution. The president doesn't seem to recognize the bounds within the Constitution, let alone the rule of law. Seems to want to ignore it left and right. And too often the Supreme Court allows the rest of the federal government to get away with overshooting what I consider the reasonable bounds of the constitutional constraints. And so you can have a document that says here are the bounds, but you've got to put that into practice. It has to be a cultural situation. And oftentimes people want stuff that somebody else pays for. Somebody described government as fiction, that we're all living at the expense of everyone else. And that's part of why it's so many people want spending on their pet project. And that's a challenge. I don't know if you've ever heard the concept of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is I fought to repeal the vehicle inspection program here in Utah, and I got half of it repealed and teed it up. So a few years later, we got the rest of it repealed. Well, this is a classic example. Concentrated benefits. Who got benefit from it? Car repair folks. Okay. You were paying money for an inspection for them to perform. So they were really interested in keeping the program there. Diffuse costs, you were only paying $20 a year or $20 every other year. Not a big deal. Wasn't worth your time to go fight against it. And even though it was widely popular to get rid of that program when we finally did, those that had a self-interest in making sure the money kept flowing were the ones to rally and fight against it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what in political studies we often call third rails of politics, things that no one wants to touch. Obviously, we have a lot of those in the federal government. We got, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Entitlements adds up to, I think last time I checked, like 55% of the annual budget. But there is given the situation right now, the inflation we've talked about, the runaway debt, the interest rates that are hurting people, there's nevertheless a almost shocking consensus between a lot of people in both parties about not touching these entitlement programs, even though many of them are set to be insolvent dramatically soon. Why do you think that is, and what can we do to maybe address that, to break what seems to be this growing consensus to not touch these things?
I'm going to describe the very first thing is most people are not numbers people. They're
Mm-hmm.
afraid of budgets. They're afraid of financial matters. And so therefore, and that's both in the public as well as elected officials. My experience in the legislature was maybe 10 out of 104 truly understood the whole budget.
Mm-hmm.
It's complex. It's difficult. And for a lot of folks, it's boring.
Mm-hmm.
We had moved our budget meetings into the morning rather than the afternoon when I was in the legislature to try and get folks when they were more awake. Because they were more interested in the policy issues than the budget. So let's put the budget in the morning when people are more awake and put the policy stuff in the afternoon that they're more passionate about. Most folks are not budget people. And so that's the first issue that exists.
Mm-hmm.
The second issue is the assumption somebody will take care of it. It will work out. I mean, people have been talking about the budgetary concerns and the out of control spending for decades. And yet we're still here. Mm-hmm. But there's an old saying, somebody said, how did you go bankrupt? Well, slowly at first, and then quickly.
Yeah.
And that's my fear. Right now, Social Security is slated to be cut over 20% within the next decade. So if you're a retiree getting benefits, that's what the math says. Now, maybe it's going to be 23% or 22%. Maybe it's going to be 10 years, 11 years, 12 years. But in essence, when they run out of money, they have to cut the benefits. And I think they just assume somebody will take care of it. Magically, the Social Security fairy will take care of this. And you're driving towards a crisis. And too often, when there's a difficult issue to face, the public does not reward elected officials for looking out in the future and trying to avoid the problem. They actually reward them for driving into the crisis and then reward them to go fix the crisis that they just created.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfortunately what's going to take place, I fear. And that's why I'm running, trying to say, no, guys, we got to do something different. But we're driving towards a cliff. And I think your retirement is too important to trust to Congress. And so fundamentally, it's not just how do we fix and modify and change Social Security, but how do we make it sustainable for the long term, for the college graduates that just graduated a month ago, and for all workers in between. And to me, that means getting the money out of Washington, D.C. and bringing it closer to the people. But that's where you have to get in, and you have to help folks actually understand, here's what's going to happen, here's what's going to take place. And I think this is a way that you can find common ground, because I don't think Democrats and Republicans want to kick grandma to the curb, but that's essentially what will happen. So now, if we want to avoid that, let's talk about ways to avoid that, because the more we put this off, the more drastic the changes will be. And there will be some that will want to raise taxes. Now, the problem with raising taxes in Social Security is any excess revenue has to get invested in treasury bonds, which means we encourage borrowing of Congress. So if we raise taxes, we'll actually drive even more debt, which is bizarre, but that is how things are set up. When it gets into Medicare, this is where we have inefficiencies with a federal government driving healthcare policy, not just Medicare, Medicaid, and even in our employer-based, insurance plans. The federal government weighs in of that's an allowable plan, that's not an allowable plan, and here's how these activities take place. We need to step in there, and I believe that we can save money and we can get healthcare that is more focused on patients rather than special interest groups, and save money at the same time. If you look at Medicaid right now, there's incentives for states to expand their Medicaid enrollment to draw money from the federal government and expand payments to other activities to draw more money from the federal government. And so California and New York really love that because they draw down even more money. And so we need to rein in those programs by at least putting a box around it and block granting that money. I'm not a fan of block grants, but you got to take steps in a better direction. So then we can at least say, we're getting rid of this incentive to draw down more money from the federal government and then empowering states to make better, more effective decisions. We also have to look and say, who is getting Medicaid? I'm one that says, if you're an able-bodied individual, you should be working before you get welfare benefits. I recognize if you're a family and you're working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and you've got a child with a severe disability, and that kicks in to help you, okay, you're using it as a last resort. And so, the program is intended to help folks like you. But if you're not working and you're able-bodied and you could be working, but you're living on the welfare instead, I got a problem with that.
Yeah. Well, it's like, one of the analogies I kind of grew up knowing about when it comes to the difference between entitlements and a safety net is this image of a bunch of people in a pit. And you can either get a bucket and hand things down to them to help them survive in the pit, or you can put down a ladder so that they can climb out of the pit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things a lot of people in the country don't understand is that the conservative view is not that we shouldn't help people who need help, not that there shouldn't be a welfare safety net for situations like you described. Hey, you're doing everything you can, and gosh dang it, I'm still falling short. Here's a little kind of pick you up to help you get back on your feet again. It's the difference between helping people thrive and make you feel comfortable while they're not thriving. Let's change gears real quick because we also wanted to talk about another topic. You have really been kind of making a name for yourself by really pushing against this MAGA populist brand. And it's very atypical right now for Republicans because a lot of Republicans are afraid to straight up say, I'm not this, I'm something else. And it's because right now there's a lot of confusion over what the difference is between conservatism and populism. Can you kind of give us an insight as to why you're embracing the messaging that you have and what you view that difference to be?
Yeah, so I come from the perspective, and I'm first and foremost a fiscal conservative, which means I believe in limited government and very low taxes and very light regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, I believe government is supposed to be about principles. I look at the Constitution and it delineates certain powers and authority for the federal government. And that's what the federal government is supposed to do. It's not supposed to be whatever I want it to be to drive whatever agenda I want to that's popular. It is supposed to do a limited set of duties. And so that's where I come from, is what are the principles for government to operate in? And then stick to those principles. But right now, too many folks don't care about what the bounds and the guardrails are. They want to do whatever they want to do. Excuse me. They come from the perspective of, might makes right.
Mm-hmm.
If I can get the majority to agree with this, then I should do it. And I should be able to do it. And I don't care about any limits. And I'll pick, a hot button topic, abortion.
Mhm.
Okay. We've spent 50 years making the case that abortion is a state issue and not a federal issue. And yet now the Supreme Court properly, from my perspective, returned it back to the states and the people. But there's a push to move it to the federal level and do a federal ban.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, where is the authority in the federal government to put that at the federal level, especially after 50 years of us making the case that it's not a federal issue, it's a state issue?
Mhm.
So this is where it's like, okay, it's no longer about the principle, it's now about populism. It's we want this at this level. And what people seem to forget, and I tell folks, whenever you create that valuable tool in statute, just remember in the hands of your opponent, it could become a dangerous weapon. And too many people enjoy when they're in the majority and forget about what it's like in the minority. And political winds change. And that's where I come from. The other key thing that causes me concern is I look back at Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, I described that the Republican Party used to be the party of big ideas.
Mhm.
Sadly, not today, but we need big ideas more than ever. Right now, when I ask people, what big ideas does the Republican Party stand for? They go, nothing. Or we're the opposition party.
Mhm.
Or they talk about vengeance and retribution. None of those are big ideas. And yet you look at the dire situation that we're in financially, you look at the challenges that we have having a strong military for whatever threat might be facing our nation. You look at how our economy has been eroded. We're excessively dependent on China right now at the same time that we're having trade wars. Right now is when we need big ideas to solve difficult problems. When Iran attacked and launched 300 missiles and drones at Israel several weeks ago, do you know who saved Israel? Ronald Reagan. His Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. We're
Mhm.
going to have the ability to shoot missiles out of the sky. This was his crazy dream in the 80s that 40 years later was saving Israel. Okay.
Mhm.
These are the kind of big ideas that we need to get back to from my perspective and get away from this culture of grievance. One of the
Mhm.
other things I'm going to share is too often we treat the opposition as the enemy. Okay. And there's going to be times you and I disagree, and that's
Mhm.
perfectly fine. In fact, our founders created a government of checks and balances to limit power. We were concerned with one individual or one group of people having too much power, and we wanted checks and balances to limit that power. So that friction in the system should be celebrated. So opposition is not the enemy. Opposition is part of the process. And
Mhm.
so we should, rather than, treating, the Democrats or whoever else as the enemy, we need to recognize they're just the opposition in the process. And we want to limit power. And that's what we need to do. We do not want an efficient, streamlined government that can run roughshod over the people. We want it checked, we want it limited, and we want it slow moving.
Yeah, I've often observed that a big part of the reason that we have this populist upswelling on both the left and the right tends to be focused on more, but there is a lot of populism on the left as well. But what has caused this is this idea that, oh, if only we can just win enough in this election, then we can get everything we want. And like you said, the system isn't designed to work that way. The system is designed to be deliberative. The system is designed to take into account as many perspectives as possible at the same table. And so when people, these politicians, these more populist figures, they promise the world if they can just win, and then they win, they run into the system, and then it doesn't work, and it makes people more and more angry, and they feel more and more lied to, and they feel more and more like the system doesn't work for them. Um,
Well,
and I
to
think
your
we need
point,
more of this sobering, mindset that you're trying to offer us today.
yeah, and to your point, they're feeling there's a lot of Americans that are feeling left behind, that they played by the rules, and yet, you know, the system was stacked against them. I know some 20 somethings who feel like they were told, go to college, whatever it costs, go to college, it'll work out, you'll get a job, buy a house. They felt like they were living by all the rules. And right now, they're struggling to buy a house.
Mm-hmm.
They're burdened with debt and they don't know what to do. And time, you look at various industries where people have lost jobs and haven't been able to reskill and feel like they're left behind. And so there is some very valid concern for folks that they're rallying. So there's valid issues behind the populism,
Mhm.
but we need to channel it into how do we get back to what are the fundamental principles rather than just drive this populism craze. And that's the challenge. And I would describe I'm a free market guy,
Mhm.
but our government colludes too often with business and steers it to the politically connected at the
Mhm.
disadvantage of others. And that's not right. And that happens time and time again. And we favor certain industries over under other industries. We're going to give tax credits. So we're going to tax you to go subsidize some politically connected cronies over here. You look at healthcare time and time again. What are some of the major drivers of cost in Medicaid and Medicare? It's it's the medical lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, the insurance lobby. All of these folks are clamoring to get a bigger piece of the pie rather than saying, how do we empower individuals with their money to shop for a better product? We, the government, are going to steer it to certain folks that are politically connected. And we talk about there's this concept. I don't know if you've heard this. It's regulatory capture concept called bootleggers and Baptists. Have you ever
Mhm.
heard this?
Sounds
Think
familiar.
back, think back at Prohibition. Okay. Who made the moral case for Prohibition? The Baptists. And who went laughing all the way to the bank? The bootleggers.
Mhm.
So ask yourself whenever it comes to a regulatory issue and there's potentially regulatory capture, ask yourself who is making the moral case and who's making the money? Because those making the moral case likely don't see those making the money. But the people making the money are happy to put the moralists front and center to justify the cause. You can think back at Obamacare, and we need universal health care, or we need prescription drugs. Okay. Who was making the moral case for that? Lots of folks. And who was making the money? Healthcare industry, pharmaceutical industry, and so forth, laughing all the way to the bank. And it happens time and time again. And you have to look past the good intentions that people are talking about and actually see what's taking place. Sometimes you'll hear about, oh, we want safety for toys or safety for food or whatever it might be. What actually happens is it's helping some politically connected group at the disadvantage of a small business, small family farm, a small toy company. It happens time and time again. Right here in the legislature, there's concerns about the price of housing. Okay. Very valid concerns. And there's lots of complex issues. What's driving the cost of housing? It's not one single simple issue. It's a very complex problem. What's the legislature going to do? Well, they want to give people, what is it, $25,000, $25,000 to buy certain new homes.
Mhm.
Okay. Ask yourself in a tight housing market where we got limited supply, what's more money going to do? It's going to go to certain politically connected developers. It's not actually going to help the homeowners because it's just going to drive up the cost of the home, and that money is going to, funnel through to the developer. So it looks like in this case, it's helping the homeowner, but it's really not helping the homeowner at all. It's helping the developer. And you can see this time and time again. And you got to step back and say, okay, what's really the big picture? I know what the words are and the good intent that's being pitched, but what's really driving it? And so that's this regulatory capture and so forth is partly why populism is gaining ground right now. When you look and say, okay, the global economy is running roughshod over various folks and they feel like they're abused and they're feeling like nobody's listening to them and the government doesn't care. Then they like, the Donald Trumps of the world and the Bernie Sanders of the world, the I'm mad as hell caucus. That's when
Mhm.
they celebrate them because they feel like they're sounding their alarm, their concern. And so that's why I want to get back to principles, but I recognize the validity of the
Right.
concerns that are underlying the movement.
Yeah, and that's such an important, crucial thing to understand. I think in the last decade, um, a lot of the response to the growing populism has been to dismiss, to belittle, and to marginalize. And I think that's a lot of the reason why it has continued to grow, whether it's successful or not successful at the ballot box. Because most populist eras are built upon legitimate concerns, legitimate problems that ordinary people are facing. But as you're alluding to, nobody gives credible solutions, and so then they turn to those who, at the very least, are avatars for their anxiety, who are going to, like you said, the mad as hell caucus. I'm done. I'm not going to take it anymore. And then people at least feel like they're heard, even if at the end of the day, there's no solutions that actually flow from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to get down and give alternatives, give options, say, hey, we hear you, but here's what here's what conservative thought and governance can provide for you. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to agree absolutely with you. And this is one of those things right now. If you flip on, I hate to use the word news, cable news, it's more cable talking heads. But if you turn that on, you don't see a lot of people seeking to understand other people and the other side or what the concerns are. They're out there, and I'm told politics is performative. And that's one of the things I struggle with. I'm a problem solver. I'm not a showman. I roll up my sleeves and I go work on difficult issues. But when it's all about the sound bites, when it's all about the social media clicks and the hits on TV, rather than actually fixing the difficult issues, that's a problem. And then we get more cynical and more cynical and more cynical because the problems don't get solved. But we're also not trying to understand, folks. Right now, we have rewarded one, being victims on one side and treating the other side as the enemy. And I don't just mean on the other side of the aisle. It can be on the other side of an issue. We can be in the same party, we can be in the same neighborhood, whatever, but you believe something different than me, or you're doing something different than me. All of a sudden, it's not just, I disagree with you, Justin. It's, you're a bad person. You're evil. And when you have contempt for somebody, that's a problem. When you disagree, that's all right. That's just part of human nature. People disagree. It's when you have contempt for somebody, when you are disgusted with them, that's when we have problems. And that is where we've become in terms of our course dialogue. We can't get into, we struggle as society to get into those debates and discussions where we disagree. And yet I come from the perspective of, usually if you got good ideas and I got good ideas, if we beat them back and forth, we're probably going to come up with better ideas together. But we have to be willing. I have to be willing to understand what your concerns are and then try and articulate and express that. Before I try and ram down my perspective to you, I need to try and understand you first. And I got to try and find some common ground to work with you. Because if I just roll in there and say, Justin, you're an idiot, are you going to want to work with me?
Of course not.
No, it's not human nature. You're going to want to buck and you're going to want to fight against it. And this, we go back to Reagan. This is one of the things. Reagan had some key principles, and he had this optimism about where he was trying to go, hope and optimism of the future, and a couple of key principles in terms of a free market, in terms of strength, peace through strength, a strong military. Those are his key principles. Faith in the American people. That's what was his guiding star, and wanting America to be that beacon of hope and opportunity, that shining city on a hill. That's where he was driving. And I honestly believe we need to get back there. We need to set that example. We shouldn't be bullies and we shouldn't be heavy-handed, but we need to get back to that optimism about the future.
Oh, yeah. And that's another reason why we decided to endorse you, is because one of the main things that we are focused on is searching out and finding and supporting those happy warriors. Now, there's all sorts of confusion over the term happy warrior. I think far too many of people that maybe are in the more populist vein of things, they think that we're saying, oh, be a pushover, or don't stand up for yourself, or different things. It's like, no. What I usually say that gets a chuckle is I say, no, you still stand up for things. You still be firm. You just do it as a well-adjusted adult, as opposed to, like you said, the whining, the yelling, the frustrating, the victimhood, because that doesn't convince anybody. That doesn't change anybody's mind. All it is like making the people who already agree with you feel good. But it's not the approach that Reagan took, where Reagan was able to sell a conservative vision to the American people and then win 49 states in his reelection in 1984. And people say, oh, that's impossible these days. That can never happen. And I'm like, what? America wasn't divided before? you know?
Well,
Um,
here's the interesting thing with Reagan. When did Reagan win the American people? He actually won them over in the 60s and the 70s.
mhm,
It materialized in the 80s when he was president, but
mhm.
he really changed the narrative and the discussion in the 60s and 70s with his vision, his speeches, his optimism about the future that then built that momentum that he got elected.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that A Time for Choosing, one of his most famous speeches, was actually given when he was campaigning for Goldwater, not for himself.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and that's yeah, and being a happy warrior, you're absolutely right. People think uh you're being a pushover, and that's not the situation. I can be firm and strong, and I can cheerfully say, yeah, make my day. You know,
hmm
try and get that over the top of me. I don't have to be angry about it. I mean, think back, in high school playing sports. Okay, you didn't have to hate the other team.
hmm
You know, there are guys I played against. I'd known for years. They're friends, and yet we're opponents. And
Yep.
this is something that people don't understand about the legislative process. Okay, I served a decade in the Utah legislature, and I may battle somebody today that I'm going to collaborate with tomorrow. Because the first rule we learned in the legislature was 38, 15, and 1, meaning you got to have the majority of the House, the majority of the Senate, and the governor to agree with you if you're going to get anything done. So what that means is those coalitions are constantly shifting. You and I
hmm
will battle on this issue today because we disagree with it, and then tomorrow we're going to partner on
Yep.
some other issue. And you just if you keep burning bridges and burning bridges and burning bridges, at some point you're going to have nobody to work with. You're not going to get anything done. And what people forget is you got to have a majority to pass something to create a new program, but you got to have a majority if you're going to repeal things. You want to cut taxes, you got to have a majority. If you're going to get rid of something the federal government's doing, you got to have a majority. In fact, you typically have to have a majority House and 60 in the Senate. So you have to have
hmm
more than just a majority, but you have to build those coalitions, and you got to be cheerful in that process if you're going to try and attract them and bring people together. And the other key thing I tell folks is if you don't care who gets the credit, you can get a lot of stuff done.
hmm
And that is absolutely true. If you're the guy, if you're the guy that wants the credit, and if you're a guy that doesn't work, but he really wants you to join with them, but if you're the guy that's going to work hard and you don't care who gets the credit, guess what? Lots of people want your help because they know you're going to help them win.
Yeah, one of my uh, great exemplars for leadership is Major Dick Winters, who was featured in the Band of Brothers book and television series. And one of his key planks of leadership is don't care who gets the credit. And it's just so important because if you focus on that aspect, focused on who gets the credit, that's when you become performative. That's when you become focused less on just making sure that the job is being done right. Um, and there's this huge trend in Congress right now where um, members of Congress are getting rid of their legislative staff and they're hiring social media staff. And they're caring more about getting in front of cable news. They're caring more about being Twitter trolls, and they're essentially not doing their jobs at all. But these are the names that are household names in some places because they're fighting. Oh, they're the ones actually doing something. But if you could kind of be a fly on the wall, I'm sure people would quickly realize that these individuals are universally despised on both sides of the aisle because they get nothing done. They don't work with anybody. And they end up not actually doing anything for the interests of their constituency because they're not actually being part of the process. Have you observed some of that, even in the state and local?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Clearly, I see it from my perspective much more at the federal level than the state level, but you still see some of it at the state level, where some people seem to be more posturing for attention than actually doing substantive work. Um, I talk about folks, workhorses and show horses.
Hmm.
And the workhorses are those that roll up their sleeves behind the scenes. They make things happen. And oftentimes you don't know who they are, but they get stuff done. And then there's the show horses you know about, but oftentimes their bill doesn't actually do what they think it does. And it
Hmm.
was more for it did something that had this nice sounding label to it. But at the end of the day, it didn't really change anything. And when you look back, um, I think one of my concerns at the federal level is some of those folks that you describe, and I'll pick Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz is performative from my perspective. His
Hmm.
antics in terms of shutting down the government, quote unquote, shutting down the government, and so forth, seems to be more about putting the Democrats in control, which I think is bad, than it
Hmm.
is about actually reining in spending. And if we really care about the fiscal issues, if I go all or nothing, there's going to be a lot of times I get nothing. So I got to be willing to compromise. And I tell folks there's two forms of compromise. Bad compromise is when you sell out your principles. Good compromise is I'm adopting better policies, moving in a better direction, but I just don't get there as quickly as I want. Go ahead and lock in the win and then come back tomorrow and fight another day and keep locking in those wins, moving in that direction. Because politics is about persuasion. Okay. I can't compel you to do something. I have to persuade you to do something. And I have to persuade the public to back you. Because if you don't have the support of your constituents, whoever that is, it's going to be hard for you to move down that path. So I've got to look to try and help you get wins with your constituency. And right now, the wins that people are getting is the attention they're getting on TV and the dollars that they get from donors rather than actually fixing the substantive issues that we have. And that's the critical issue to me. I think our national debt is one of the greatest national security risks that we have because it invades so many aspects of our lives, our economy, and makes us weak when we're trying to project strength internationally. And we're trying to say where are the next threats coming from? We're not well situated. And right now it seems like we're more focused on TikTok and banning TikTok. Well, you and I, we can take TikTok off our phones. Okay,
Hmm.
TikTok doesn't have to control us because we can turn it off. I can't build an aircraft carrier. I can't build a submarine. I can't build a fighter jet, but I can turn TikTok off. But
Hmm.
guess what gets more attention? The TikTok debate. Okay,
Hmm.
look, it's the shiny thing that we can all relate with rather than the more serious issues about what kind of munitions and weapons do we need in the future? And what is taking place with our supply chain, whether it's rare earth elements, whether it's pharmaceuticals, and so forth, that we're so dependent on others. And why are we pushing? And I believe the federal government is actively or you know, by design or by default, engaging in regulatory and tax policies that push businesses offshore. I mean, the simple fact is capital flows where it's rewarded and it flees where it's punished. And if you ask yourself, if you're trying to start a business today, how well does the United States of America welcome those businesses? And
Hmm.
how much do they put up hurdles and roadblocks and basically say it's easier to go do business with China? It's easier to go do business in South America. It's easier to go do business elsewhere rather than do it right here. And we should be asking when we go back to the populism issue, and you're talking about folks that don't have upward mobility and they're losing jobs and they're losing good paying jobs for entry level work and they can't provide for their family and they're in despair and they're doing drugs and so forth. Well, ask yourself, what kind of policies has the federal government engaged in that is incentivizing the offshoring of these businesses rather than having America be the most welcoming place? I mean, I believe that we should have the lowest taxes, the lightest regulation, and the freest markets so that businesses want to do business here. And instead, what are we doing today? Well, Joe Biden with the CHIPS Act is bribing semiconductor companies to come back to America. So we're paying taxpayer money to bribe them back. And then he layers on a bunch of liberal uh, programs in exchange for the dollars. Well, if you're going to take these dollars, you got to do this stuff. And, and to me, that is just not the way we should be doing it. But we need to be stepping back to say, what are the actions that are taking place in Congress that are driving down this path that is resulting in the movement for populism that is more about performance and not about substance. And we got to get back to those principles that are critical. And I talk about the principles of limited government, fiscal responsibility, and free enterprise. You know, individual liberty for you and I to do what we think is best. And this means a federal government that doesn't have to be all things to all people. Okay? How do we shrink? Just imagine if all we fought about at the federal level was national defense.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, what do we fight about? We fight about, the plethora of everything that's there. And it's because the federal government has grown well beyond what it should be.
Yeah, I was interested to discover, as I've done a lot of academic level studies on the founding fathers, and they didn't use the term federal government. Federalism described our overall system of government. The term they used for the national level was the general government.
Mm-hmm.
And that always just really kind of struck me, that really kind of dials home on what their intent was for how these different levels of government were to work, is that the national level was supposed to be for general concerns, general legislation, and to leave as much of the governing of the country to state and local levels as was possible. And I think that kind of gets into what you're talking about.
But you talk about the general, and that's, to me, largely outward facing, national defense, and then interactions between the states. Making sure one state doesn't unfairly treat another state.
Exactly.
Pretty much
we appreciate you coming on here. We view you as one of the workhorses. You have a documented background of showing that you are consistent in fiscal conservatism. You don't play partisan favors. When you were the state auditor, you kept both sides in line. And we believe from a conservative mindset that you want to go with the tried and true over the new and untested. And so we've endorsed you as a workhorse. We're trying to do what we can to get the workhorses in public view, and try to compete a little bit with the show ponies. And we thank you so much for being here with us and have this conversation. Hopefully we can have you on again and discuss some other issues in the future.
Fantastic. Justin, thank you so much. Take care.
Yep. Have a good one.
You too.